Welcome to Hard Script.
By the end of that week, after the fifth sentence left her mouth, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask questions. I didn't argue. I just stopped responding the way I always had. It started in the office, late afternoon, with dust still on my boots from a site visit. The crew had wrapped early, and the place felt hollow. She was leaning against the conference table, scrolling on her phone, smiling at something that clearly wasn't work. When I asked if payroll had gone out, she looked up like I'd interrupted her. She said I was tense lately, said I took everything too personally, said maybe I should let other people handle things instead of acting like everything would fall apart without me. That was the first line. I let it pass. I walked into my office and closed the door. Through the glass, I saw her lean back toward Mark, my lead foreman, the guy I trusted to open sites before dawn and lock them after dark, the guy who'd been in my house for barbecues, who knew my kids' names, who knew where I kept spare keys. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. Their body language did all the work. The second line came the next day, in the truck, when she said Mark understood the business better than I gave him credit for, that he saw things I didn't. She said it casually, like an observation, like a correction. The third came at dinner, when she laughed and said I used to be more driven, that lately I just reacted instead of leading. She didn't look at me when she said it. She cut her chicken and kept eating. The fourth came in the form of comparison. She said Mark handled pressure better, that he stayed calm, that some men were just built differently. By then, I wasn't listening for tone. I was watching patterns. In the mornings, she left earlier. In the evenings, she came home distracted, phone always face down. At work, Mark stopped checking in with me. He went through her. Change orders, material calls, crew issues, everything filtered through her office. The fifth line came in front of two supervisors, right there by the blueprint rack. She said maybe I should step back for a while. Focus on big picture stuff. She smiled when she said it. Not at me. At the room. That was the moment I understood I wasn't being pushed out emotionally. I was being replaced structurally. I nodded. I grabbed my jacket. I left the office early for the first time in years. That night, while she slept, I didn't check her phone. I didn't confront anyone. I opened my laptop and pulled up the company files. I didn't disappear. I just stopped showing up the way they expected. The next morning, nothing looked different on the surface. Trucks rolled out, crews moved, permits sat where they always had. She walked in confident, coffee in hand, already issuing instructions before anyone asked. Mark followed a few steps behind her, not like an employee, more like an extension. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. I didn't change my routine. I signed off on deliveries, returned a few calls, nodded where people expected a nod. What changed was where I stood. I stopped placing myself at the center. I started watching from the edges. By mid-morning, one of the electricians lingered in my doorway longer than necessary. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. He mentioned that Mark had rerouted a crew without clearing it with me. He mentioned it lightly, like gossip disguised as logistics. Then he added that my wife had approved it immediately. That was the first external confirmation. Not proof. Alignment. At lunch, my accountant called about an invoice that had been fast-tracked. Materials ordered under Mark's authorization, approved by her credentials. It wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the frequency. And the silence. No one had looped me in. I didn't call her. I didn't confront Mark. I approved the invoice and archived the email. In the afternoon, a client asked if I was still overseeing their build or if Mark was now the point person. The question landed cleanly, without malice. Someone had already told them there was a shift. When I walked past her office, the door was closed. Not locked. Closed. Through the glass, I saw her leaning forward, elbows on the desk, listening to Mark with an attention I hadn't seen in months. She smiled once. Not wide. Controlled. Familiar. Later, as we packed up, she mentioned casually that Mark had been a huge help lately. She said it like a compliment I should share. Like recognition I should grant. She added that it felt good not carrying everything alone anymore. I nodded. I grabbed my keys. I told her I had paperwork to catch up on at home. That evening, I didn't ask where she'd been when she came back later than usual. I didn't ask why her phone buzzed twice and she turned it face down without checking it. I watched her move through the house like someone who had already rearranged the furniture in her head. After she went to sleep, I didn't open messages. I opened folders. I traced authorizations. I followed signatures. I mapped access. By the time I shut the laptop, It was clear this hadn't started this week. This was just the week they stopped hiding it. I started treating the business like a crime scene that hadn't been cleaned yet. Nothing dramatic. No sudden moves. Just quiet documentation. I printed nothing. I forwarded nothing. I watched. In the mornings, I arrived early and logged into systems I hadn't needed to touch in years. Vendor portals. Project management software. Banking dashboards. Everything still carried my credentials, even if no one expected me to use them anymore. That assumption worked in my favor. I noticed patterns before specifics. Materials ordered twice under different job codes. Labor hours shifted between sites without written approval. Bonuses paid out early, always tied to projects Mark oversaw. Every transaction had her authorization attached to it, clean and proper, like a signature practiced until it stopped looking like handwriting. At work, they moved comfortably around me. Mark stopped pretending to loop me in. He spoke openly with suppliers when I was within earshot, using language that implied authority. My wife backed him without hesitation, correcting others when they deferred to me. She didn't look hostile. She looked efficient. One afternoon, I stayed late after everyone cleared out. The office was quiet enough to hear the HVAC cycle on and off. I pulled up archived messages tied to company devices. Not personal texts. Internal chat logs. Work-related threads that had no reason to be deleted. There it was. Not explicit. Never careless. Long conversations that drifted from deadlines into shared frustration, then into encouragement, then into familiarity that had nothing to do with concrete or schedules. Late-night check-ins framed as updates. Compliments disguised as professional respect. I didn't read them twice. I didn't need to. At home, she moved through rooms like someone rehearsing a future version of herself. She talked about the company as if it had already outgrown me. She mentioned Mark's name easily, without tension, without caution. She assumed I was too busy or too tired to notice. That evening, she said I seemed calmer lately. She said it like approval, like I had finally learned my place. I nodded. I agreed. I told her I was letting go of things that didn't need my constant attention. Later, while she showered, her phone lit up on the counter. A notification preview flashed just long enough. A shared joke. An inside reference. Something that belonged to two people who spoke every day. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't memorize the message. I went back to the laptop and opened a new folder. I labeled it with a neutral name that wouldn't stand out if someone glanced over my shoulder. Inside it, I began assembling the quiet truth. Not for confrontation. For closure. I didn't announce anything. That was the point. I stopped correcting people when they went to her instead of me. I stopped stepping in when Mark overrode decisions that used to be mine. I let the machine keep running the way they wanted it to. From the outside, it looked like trust. From the inside, it was withdrawal. I began shifting my presence in small ways that felt invisible unless you were looking for them. I stopped joining morning site check-ins. I canceled a few lunches without explanation. I forwarded calls instead of returning them. When someone asked if I was off that day, I smiled and said I was handling things elsewhere. She didn't notice at first. She was busy, energized. The company had become her stage. She spoke with authority that used to belong to both of us. She moved through the office like she owned the air. Mark mirrored her confidence, never ahead of her, never behind. Always aligned. At home, I packed quietly. Not bags. Files. Originals. Contracts that still carried my name as founder. Operating agreements she hadn't touched since the early years. Passwords written down when we still trusted paper more than people. One evening, she mentioned that Mark might take on more responsibility soon. She said it like a test, like she was waiting for resistance. I gave her none. I said it sounded efficient. That was the first crack. She paused, just long enough. The next day, I didn't come into the office. I didn't text. I didn't call. I let the hours pass. By evening, my phone showed missed notifications. A few from her. One from Mark. All professional in tone. All asking where I was. I didn't respond. The following morning, I rerouted company access remotely. Nothing dramatic. No lock slammed shut. Just adjustments. Approval thresholds changed. Signature authority narrowed. Certain permissions reverted to defaults that only I controlled. At work, they felt it immediately. Processes slowed. Decisions stalled. Questions bounced back unanswered. She called again. This time her voice carried tension she couldn't hide. She asked if something was wrong. She said people were confused. She said she needed me to be available. I let it ring. I spent that day somewhere quiet, reviewing final drafts prepared weeks earlier. Legal language doesn't accuse. It doesn't explain. It just states facts until there's no room left to argue. That night, I slept somewhere else. I didn't leave a note. I didn't disappear to punish her. I disappeared to remove myself from a structure that no longer included me. By the time they realized I wasn't coming back on my own, the structure had already shifted. Mark felt it first. He tried to push a payment through for a supplier he favored, one he'd been working with closely. The approval bounced back. He tried again through a different channel. Same result. He wasn't used to resistance. Not lately. She noticed next. Not emotionally. Logistically. The business stopped responding to her the way it used to. Systems that had bent around her authority went rigid. Vendors asked for confirmations she couldn't provide. Clients requested signatures she no longer had the power to give. She left me a message that evening, controlled but sharp. She said the company needed clarity. She said my silence was unprofessional. She said people were starting to talk. I didn't answer. Instead, I met with an attorney in a quiet office that didn't display family photos or motivational quotes. We reviewed documents I prepared over weeks. She didn't ask why. She just asked if I was sure. I nodded. She slid the papers into a folder and told me they would be ready to serve when I said the word. At work, Mark tried a different angle. He sent a message framed as concern. He said the crews were confused. He said my wife was under a lot of pressure. He said maybe the three of us should sit down and clear the air. I archived the message. That afternoon, I reassigned him. Not fired. Not demoted. Reassigned to a project that required constant reporting and zero discretion. A site far from the office, far from her. The notice went out automatically. No explanation attached. The reaction was immediate. He pushed back through official channels. She followed up personally. She said this wasn't the time for power moves. She said it felt like I was trying to make a point. She was right about one thing. It was a point, just not the one she thought. That night, I authorized the next phase. Company ownership restructured. Her operational role dissolved into a consulting position with no authority over people or money. Mark's access narrowed to execution only. Everything legal. Everything clean. The documents were delivered the next morning by someone who wasn't me. Her response didn't come right away. When it did, it wasn't anger. It was disbelief. She said there had to be a mistake. She said she didn't understand how things escalated so quickly. Mark called again. This time his message wasn't professional. It was defensive. He said he'd been loyal. He said he didn't deserve this. I listened to the voicemail once. Then I deleted it. I didn't set out to surprise them. I just stopped holding together a system that was already working against me. The fallout didn't happen in private. That was the part she hadn't calculated. Word moved through the company without anyone needing to explain it. Access changed. Titles adjusted. Emails redirected. People noticed who was suddenly absent from decisions and who wasn't answering questions anymore. Silence does that. It creates its own narrative. She walked into the office that morning expecting resistance she could manage. What she found was distance she couldn't close. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. People stayed polite but brief. The supervisors who used to check in with her now waited for written confirmation from legal. A vendor asked, in front of two project managers, whether her consulting role still allowed approvals. She smiled and said yes. No one followed up. Mark didn't fare better. On site, crews stopped asking for his opinion. They waited for instructions that came through official channels instead. A supplier asked him to confirm payment terms and copied me by default. He tried to assert authority and sounded unsure even to himself. At lunch, one of the senior supervisors said something that wasn't meant to wound, but did. He said it was strange how fast things shifted when structure changed. He said he hadn't realized how much weight my name still carried. She heard it. Everyone did. By the afternoon, she tried to regain control the only way she knew how. She called a meeting. Not formal. Not announced. Just a gathering framed as alignment. Fewer people showed up than she expected. Those who did stayed near the door. No one volunteered opinions. When she spoke about vision and teamwork, the room felt like it was listening out of obligation, not belief. Mark stood beside her, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't add anything. He couldn't. Afterward, someone asked quietly who they should report to going forward. Not her. Not him. Just the system. That evening, Messages reached me through third parties, friends in the industry, a partner who'd known us both. They didn't ask what happened. They asked if I was okay. They said they hadn't realized things were unstable until now. She finally reached me directly, not with accusations, with confusion. She said she didn't understand why people were pulling away. She said it felt like everyone had decided something without telling her. I didn't respond, because nothing had been decided in secret. They were just seeing the structure without the illusion holding it together. Once the noise settled, what remained was absence. Not dramatic, not loud, just space where support used to be. She felt it first outside the office. Invitations slowed. Messages went unanswered longer than usual. Friends who used to call for advice suddenly had reasons to be busy. People she'd helped climb now avoided being seen too close. No one cut her off directly. They just stopped leaning in. Mark stayed close to her at first. Too close. He hovered in the gaps I'd left behind, trying to replace what had vanished. He talked more than usual, filled silence with plans and reassurance. But without authority, without access, his confidence thinned. He couldn't fix what he didn't control. At work, her role shrank in ways no title change could explain. She was present but peripheral. Decisions happened around her. Information reached her late, if at all. When problems arose, people escalated past her instinctively. She corrected them once, then stopped. I watched from a distance that wasn't accidental. I passed through the office occasionally, not to intervene, just to be seen. I didn't linger. I didn't engage. The effect was immediate. Conversations adjusted. Postures straightened. The structure recognized its original load-bearing point. She noticed that too. One evening, she came home and sat across from me without speaking. Her phone stayed untouched on the table. She looked smaller in that quiet, like someone who had misplaced a map and didn't want to admit it. She didn't accuse. She didn't explain. She asked if we could talk. I told her I had already said everything I needed to say. That night, she slept poorly. She moved restlessly, checking her phone, stepping out of the room to take calls that ended quickly. Mark's messages grew erratic, less confident, more urgent. He needed reassurance she could no longer give. At work, someone finally asked her outright who was in charge now. Not disrespectfully, just practically. She hesitated before answering. That pause did more damage than any rumor. By then, she wasn't fighting me. She was fighting the silence left behind. And silence doesn't negotiate. It just reveals who still stands when no one is holding the structure together for you. The confrontation didn't arrive the way she imagined it would. There was no raised voice, no dramatic entrance, no demand for explanations. It happened quietly, in a space that had already lost its warmth. She waited until the house was still. She sat across from me, hands folded, posture careful, like she was approaching a meeting she hadn't prepared for. She didn't accuse me of anything. She didn't mention Mark. She didn't bring up the company. She said she needed to understand what was happening. I stayed where I was. I didn't lean forward. I didn't cross my arms. I let the silence stretch until it stopped being a pause and became a presence. She filled it the way people do when they're losing control. She said she felt shut out. She said things had escalated without warning. She said it felt like I'd decided everything without her. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. I let her finish. When I spoke, it wasn't to explain. It was to clarify a boundary that had already been crossed. I told her I wasn't having this conversation to negotiate outcomes. I told her I wasn't confused about what had happened. I told her I wasn't angry. That unsettled her more than shouting ever could have. She asked if this was about Mark. She asked if I thought something inappropriate had happened. She framed it carefully, like someone trying to steer a conversation away from a cliff edge. I didn't answer the question. I told her I had already stepped out of roles that no longer belonged to me. I told her the company would continue without disruption. I told her legal matters were being handled professionally. I told her personal matters would follow the same standard. Her composure cracked then. Not dramatically, subtly. Her voice shifted. She said she never meant for things to go this far. She said she felt like she was being erased. She said she didn't know how we got here. I told her that how we got there wasn't relevant anymore. What mattered was that I was already gone from the places where my presence had been taken for granted. She reached for something emotional. I stayed factual. She looked at me like she was seeing the end of something she'd assumed was permanent. I didn't stand up. I didn't leave the room. I just made it clear that whatever came next wouldn't involve me explaining myself again. The collapse didn't come all at once. It came in layers, each one quieter than the last. At work, Mark unraveled first. Without her authority behind him, his position thinned to what it had always been before trust elevated it. Crews questioned him openly. A project stalled when he couldn't approve a change order. A supplier refused to release materials without written confirmation that never came. He grew sharp with people who didn't respond. They responded less. She tried to stabilize him. That effort alone exposed how little ground she still had. Her messages went unanswered. Her calls were returned late. When she showed up on site unannounced, conversations stopped and resumed only after she left. No one argued with her. They just didn't follow. At home, the atmosphere changed. She moved through rooms like a guest waiting for permission. She slept lightly. She watched her phone with an intensity that never paid off. Mark's name appeared less often. When it did, the tone was different. Short, defensive, strained. The business kept moving. That was the most damaging part. Projects didn't collapse. Clients didn't panic. The company adjusted to the new structure with minimal friction. People adapted faster than she expected, faster than she could. One afternoon, a mutual contact mentioned, without judgment, that things seemed calmer lately. More organized. Less tension. The comment wasn't meant to hurt. It landed anyway. That evening, she sat alone in the living room long after the lights should have been off. She didn't call me. She didn't ask for anything. She just stayed there, staring at nothing, like someone replaying moments they'd skipped over too quickly. Later, Mark stopped coming by entirely. Whatever had bound them dissolved under pressure. Without access, without power, without secrecy, there was nothing left to hold. His messages ended with excuses. Then silence. She lost more than a role. She lost rhythm, routine, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing where you stand. Social invitations faded. Professional respect narrowed. Even sympathy had limits. I watched none of it up close. By then, I had already stepped into a life that didn't require monitoring her decline. Her collapse wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the absence of everything she'd assumed would stay. The end didn't arrive with a conversation. It arrived with paperwork. The envelope was waiting when she came home, placed neatly on the table where we used to sort mail together. No note. No explanation. Just documents prepared with the same care I'd once given to bids and contracts. Divorce filing. Company separation finalized. Terms outlined without emotion. She stood there for a long time before opening it. I didn't watch. I didn't need to. Later, she came into the room holding the papers like they might fall apart if she loosened her grip. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She asked if this was really happening. I told her it already had. She said she wished I'd said something earlier. She said she would have listened. She said she hadn't realized how far things had gone until everything stopped responding to her. I didn't correct her, because this wasn't about distance traveled. It was about direction chosen. She asked if there was any room left to fix things. Not the company, not the damage, just us. She spoke carefully, like someone who finally understood the cost of misreading silence. I told her I wasn't interested in revisiting places where respect had been optional. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I wasn't here to punish her. I told her this wasn't a disappearance. It was a withdrawal. She sat down slowly, like the weight of the words had finally reached her. For the first time in weeks, she looked at me without calculation, without strategy, just loss. I picked up my keys. Not in a rush. Not to make a point. At the door, I stopped. Not for drama. Just to close the moment properly. I told her I hadn't vanished. I told her I'd simply stopped showing up where my presence was treated as replaceable. Then I left. Outside, the air felt clear in a way I hadn't noticed in years. The company would continue. My life already had. Whatever she rebuilt next wouldn't include me as a foundation. And that was the quiet truth she would have to live with. Not that I walked away, but that I no longer needed to stay. Real men don't explode. They exit. Subscribe for more power stories.